I was thinking about this earlier today, but usually when we look at a map of the world, there's this expectation of absolute objective reality.
Oh, sure.
Like a satellite photo. You see the continents, the blue of the oceans, the little black lines dividing up all the countries, and you just accept it.
Right. It's just a given.
Yeah. You point to a spot and you say, there it is. That's the world. That is how things are. We treat it as this completely factual, neutral document.
It feels like a mathematical certainty. I mean, humans really crave that. We like reality to be charted out, visible, and completely categorized for us.
Totally.
Because it gives us this sense of control over our environment to believe that the boundaries we see on a piece of paper represent some fundamental truth about the Earth.
But then you step into the world of postcolonial theory, and suddenly that map starts to look less like a photograph of the Earth and, well, much more like a painting.
A very specific painting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A painting created by a very specific artist with a very specific agenda, holding a very large brush. You start to realize we are looking at a geographical and historical landscape that is, honestly, it's murky.
Extremely murky.
You realize those lines weren't drawn by mountains and rivers. They were drawn by armies and treaties and colonial administrators who, in a lot of cases, had never even set foot in the places they were dividing up.
Right. It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, the map isn't the territory, as the old saying goes.
Right.
But what happens when the map actively erases the territory? What happens when the act of drawing the map is actually an act of violence that wipes out the people who are already living there?
And that question is exactly what we're plunging into today on this deep dive. We are taking on a stack of sources that deal with the incredibly dense, intellectually rigorous, and just revolutionary ideas of Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak.
Okay.
And our mission today is highly specific and, frankly, a little intimidating. We're going to take her theories and translate them into the simplest, most accessible language possible. Because reading Spivak is, well, it's a workout.
Which is putting it mildly. I mean, Spivak is an absolute giant in the fields of literary theory, feminism, postcolonial studies. Her work has fundamentally shifted how scholars understand history and literature.
But she's tough to read.
Oh, notoriously difficult to parse. Her writing is complex, it's layered, and it demands an immense amount of background knowledge from the reader. She absolutely does not hold your hand.
No, she does not. I won't lie. Staring down these sources was daunting. But cracking the code of what she's saying is incredibly rewarding.
It really is.
And we want to do that heavy lifting today so that her core concepts just click for you, the listener. Because understanding Spivak doesn't just help you, pass a literature seminar. It actually changes how you read the morning news, how you watch movies, how you understand global politics.
Yeah, it rewires your brain a bit.
It does. Once you see the world through this lens, the invisible structures of power suddenly become hypervisible. You really cannot unsee it.
No, you can't. And to do this, we are pulling from a really rich stack of sources. We're looking at excerpts from her major groundbreaking texts like a critique of postcolonial reason.
Right.
And we've got interviews collected in the Postcolonial Critic. We also have some incredibly helpful analytical books that contextualize her work, specifically Sangeeta Ray's, in other words, and Stephen Morton's book, simply titled Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak.
Which are so helpful.
Vital, because they help break down her dense philosophical prose into manageable historical frameworks.
So let's set the stage before we really get into the theories themselves. Who is Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak? Where does she come from? And why does her perspective matter so much?
So her biography is deeply intertwined with her philosophy. She was born in Calcutta, India in 1942. And that date and that location are crucial.
Right, because of what was happening then.
Exactly. She was born exactly 5 years before India finally gained independence from British colonial rule. And 1942 was also the beginning of the devastating Bengal famine, which was an artificial famine exacerbated by British wartime policies, which killed millions of people.
So she is born right in the twilight of the British Empire, just surrounded by the catastrophic material consequences of colonialism.
Yes.
She is experiencing the immediate aftermath and the massive chaotic shifts of decolonization as she grows up.
Yeah, and at the exact same time, she was a brilliant student within a very traditional educational system left over from the British. She graduated with a first-class honors degree in English from the University of Calcutta, literally winning gold medals for her work in English and Bengali literature.
See, that creates such a fascinating tension. She is steeped in this traditional colonial-era British education system. She's sitting in Calcutta reading Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton.
Right.
But she's doing so from the vantage point of a newly independent India that was just ravaged by the very people who wrote those books.
That tension is the engine of her entire career. I mean, she later moved to the United States for her graduate studies at Cornell University, eventually becoming one of the most prominent academics in the world. But the moment that truly catapulted her to academic superstardom happened in 1976.
What happened in 76?
She translated a book by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida called Of Grammatology.
And Derrida is the father of deconstruction, right?
Yeah.
Another incredibly dense thinker.
Exactly. Derrida's work is all about how language constructs reality and how every text has these hidden contradictions that can be unraveled or, deconstructed.
Okay.
And Spivak not only translated this famously difficult French text into English, but she wrote this massive, brilliant preface for it that explained Derrida better than Derrida explained himself.
That's amazing.
Right. What makes Spivak so vital to our understanding of the world today is that she bridges high European philosophies of think Kant, Hegel, Marx, Derrida, with the lived material realities of the global South.
Oh, I see. So she uses the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, so to speak.
Exactly that.
She takes the intricate machinery of Western philosophy and points it right back at the blind spots of Western philosophy.
That is exactly what she does. She exposes how much of Western Enlightenment thinking was built on the silent backs of the colonized world.
Which brings us to our first major concept, and it connects perfectly back to our opening metaphor about the map. To understand how to read the world today, we first have to understand how the world's history was written, and more importantly, who did the writing.
Right.
The sources talk about a concept Spivak calls worlding. How does that work?
So worlding is Spivak's way of tackling the colonial mindset at its very root. It's the assumption made by European colonizers that when they arrived in a new land, whether that was the Americas, Australia, or parts of Africa and Asia, they were encountering it as terra nullius.
Terra nullius, that's Latin for nobody's land, right?
Correct. It's this legal and philosophical concept of empty, uninscribed earth. The colonizers treated these deeply populated, culturally rich, ancient lands as if they were just blank slates.
Just totally empty.
Yeah, they pretended these spaces were entirely devoid of history, culture, or political sovereignty. Just sitting there passively, waiting for the Europeans to arrive and write civilization upon them.
So it's like moving into a fully furnished house with another family already living inside.
Oh, I like this analogy.
Right. You walk through the front door, you look around at their furniture, their photos on the wall, their lives happening right in front of you, and you just loudly declare it an empty fixer-upper.
Yes.
You just start painting the walls, knocking down pillars, and claiming you built the place from scratch.
And if the family already living there are objects, you simply say they don't count as real inhabitants because they don't have the same kind of mortgage paperwork you brought with you.
Wow. Yeah, exactly.
That is the essence of worlding. And the violence of that act goes beyond just, drawing lines on paper or planting a flag. It is about controlling reality through language and text. By defining the land as empty and the native people as, quote-unquote, without history or without culture, you logically justify the violent taking of that land.
Because in your own mind, you aren't stealing anything. You are improving a blank space. You are bringing order to chaos.
Yes. The colonizer worlds the world into existence. They force their reality, their economic systems, their religion, and their language onto the colonized space. And they record that process as the absolute beginning of history for that region.
So before that, there was nothing.
Right. Think about cartography. When a British explorer discovered a massive lake in Africa and named it Lake Victoria, he was worlding. He was erasing whatever ancient names the local populations had for that body of water, and he was stamping the British monarchy onto the very geography of the earth.
And once it's printed on a map in London as Lake Victoria, that becomes the official objective reality for the rest of the globe.
Exactly.
That leads me to something else Spivak talks about with her students, which I think is just a brilliant way to understand how we still do this today. She talks about the instant soup syndrome.
Oh, yes. The instant soup metaphor is one of her most accessible and, I think, striking critiques of modern education and media consumption. Spivak tells her university students in the U.S. that we often consume knowledge exactly the way we consume instant soup.
Meaning we want it fast, we want it easy, and we don't really want to think about where it came from. We just rip open the packet.
Exactly. We get this packaged powder of historical facts, cultural assumptions, or news narratives. We add the hot water of our own enthusiasm, our own good intentions, and our quick moral judgments, and we just eat it up. We consume it immediately.
We don't read the ingredients list. And even if we do, we certainly don't ask about the factory that made the powder.
Never. We never stop to ask how that soup was manufactured. We don't ask who owns the factory, what power dynamics produced that specific package of knowledge, or what indigenous histories were ground up and destroyed to make that convenient little packet of information.
Just take it as truth.
Yeah, we just accept the worlding of the world as natural, as a given fact. We accept the map as the territory.
You know, when you think about it, social media is basically an instant soup factory on overdrive.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the last time you, as a listener, read a headline about a developing nation. Maybe it's a story about political instability or an economic crisis. Spivak is essentially asking you, are you just adding hot water to a colonial narrative?
Right.
Are you accepting a version of reality that was packaged by someone who views that part of the world through the lens of terra nullius?
It really forces you to pause, because the knowledge we receive about the global South and the West is rarely neutral. It is heavily processed. It has been shaped by centuries of assumptions about who is rational, who is civilized, and who needs to be saved or managed.
Right.
If you just consume the instant soup, you are participating in that ongoing erasure.
Okay, so this brings up a huge problem. If our knowledge of the world is basically instant soup, manufactured by a long history of colonialism and power imbalances, how do we begin to engage with the world ethically? I mean, if the map is lying to us, how do we navigate without just imposing our own false realities on other people?
We have to unlearn. We have to engage in a rigorous process of dismantling our own assumptions. And Spivak has a very specific and somewhat controversial mandate for how to do this. She says we must engage in, quote, unlearning one's privilege as one's loss.
Wait, hold on. Unlearning privilege as a loss.
Yes.
That sounds entirely backward to how we talk about privilege today. I mean, if I go on social media right now, checking your privilege is talked about as a gain.
Right, like a badge of honor.
Yeah. You recognize your bias, and boom, you gain empathy. You gain a broader perspective. You become a better, more enlightened person. It's treated like leveling up in a video game. Why on earth would Spivak insist it's a loss?
Because Spivak isn't interested in making you feel good about yourself.
Okay.
That is the exact tension she wants you to feel. When she says we must unlearn our privilege as a loss, she is pointing to the psychological reality of what genuine unlearning actually requires. Our privilege, whether it's class, race, gender, education, or just the geographical luck of living in the global north, it has provided us with a very comfortable, very stable worldview.
It gives us the illusion that we hold the objective map.
Yes, it gives us the illusion that our perspective is the center of the universe, that our specific way of reasoning is universal and applicable to everyone.
Which it isn't.
Exactly. To truly understand other kinds of knowledge, to truly listen to people who have been marginalized, you have to give up that comfort. You have to lose the illusion that you are the protagonist of reality. And that genuinely feels like a loss. It is painful. It's a loss of certainty, a loss of authority, and a loss of all the easy answers you used to rely on.
It means recognizing that your privileges haven't just given you an advantage. They have actually functioned as blinders.
Yes.
Your elite education, your wealth, your status, they have actively blocked you from seeing the whole picture. Losing those blinders is disorienting. It's like realizing you've been looking through the wrong end of a telescope your whole life.
And she is very clear that you can't just magically declare yourself free of bias. You can't just say, I acknowledge my privilege and move on. You have to do what she calls the homework.
The homework. What does doing the homework actually look like in this context?
It means investigating the historical and economic systems that put you on top. It means studying the languages, the histories, and the complex realities of the people you are trying to understand, rather than just projecting your own assumptions onto them.
So real effort.
It is intense, rigorous, intellectual, and emotional labor. You have to trace the supply chain of your instant soup all the way back to the extraction of the raw materials.
But I imagine this process of doing the homework and feeling this profound sense of loss causes a lot of people to just, I don't know, short circuit. Like it's too hard. It's too guilt-inducing.
Oh, it absolutely does. And Spivak talks extensively about her frustration with a very specific reaction she sees often in Western academia and activism.
What reaction is that?
It's the attitude of someone who realizes their privilege and says, well, I am just a bourgeois white male. Everything I say is tainted by imperialism. Therefore, I have no right to speak. I cannot possibly understand the other, so I will just remain silent and step away.
Oh, wow. Yes, you see that constantly.
Right.
It's a sort of performative guilt. People think they are doing the noble thing by recusing themselves from the conversation entirely. They think silence is the most respectful option.
But Spivak argues that this silence is actually a lazy cop-out.
A cop-out.
In fact, she argues it is just another form of centering yourself. By saying, I am too privileged to speak, you are making the entire situation about your guilt, your purity, and your feelings.
Oh, man. That hits hard.
It does. You are washing your hands of the difficult ethical work. Instead of silencing yourself, she says, you should develop a productive rage against the history that wrote that script for you.
That is a fascinating way to frame it. You were handed a script of privilege and oppression. You didn't write it, but you're holding it. Don't just sit down on the stage and refuse to read your lines. Figure out how the script was written, tear it apart, and figure out how to improvise a new dialogue.
Exactly. She says the goal is to learn to speak to the other in a way that actually allows them to answer back.
In a way that allows them to answer back. That fundamentally changes the dynamic.
It really does.
It's not about you being a savior coming in to speak for them, and it's not about self-flagellation where you refuse to speak at all. It's about dismantling the communication barrier that your privilege created in the first place. It's like building a two-way radio instead of just broadcasting from a megaphone.
It's about establishing an ethical relation. It's doing the grueling homework so that when you do speak, you aren't just imposing your worlding onto them.
Okay. So let's say you're doing the homework. You're unlearning your privilege as a loss. It hurts, but you're doing it.
Yeah.
You are trying to engage ethically.
Right.
But eventually, you have to actually do something in the physical world.
Right.
You have to organize politically or fight for labor rights or protest a war. And to do that, you can't just be an isolated individual having an ethical epiphany in your bedroom.
No, you can't.
You usually have to group people together to have any political power. You have to fight for women or the working class or immigrants. But if everyone's experience is so totally unique, and if any broad category is basically just more instant soup, how do you group up without accidentally erasing the diverse, complicated individuals inside that group? Doesn't activism just fall apart if we can't use labels?
This is the exact practical problem Spivak was trying to solve, and it brings us to one of her most famous and frankly most debated concepts, strategic essentialism.
Strategic essentialism. Let's break this down. What is essentialism in the first place, and why do philosophers usually hate it?
So, in philosophy and social theory, essentialism is the idea that a group of people or things have a fixed underlying essence or a true unchanging nature.
Like a stereotype.
Exactly. For example, essentialist thinking would say, all women are naturally nurturing and maternal, or all people from this specific nation are inherently hardworking and stoic.
It takes a massive, diverse group of millions of people and reduces them down to one simple, biologically or culturally hardwired trait.
Exactly. Most modern critical theorists, including Spivak, argue that essentialism is incredibly dangerous. It ignores the messy, complex reality of individuals. It creates stereotypes. Oppressive regimes almost always use essentialism to justify their actions, claiming that a certain minority group is essentially deceptive or dangerous, which justifies locking them up.
So the academic instinct is to completely reject essentialism and insist that everyone is a unique, fractured, complex individual.
But as you just pointed out, if you completely reject any kind of group identity, how do you mobilize a political movement?
You can't. You can't have a protest march of 1 million totally distinct individuals who refuse to find any common ground. You can't lobby Congress on behalf of 3 million people who share absolutely no defining characteristics. You need solidarity.
Right. So Spivak proposed strategic essentialism. This is the idea of temporarily and very consciously accepting a broad, simplified label, an essence for the sake of political mobilization. You group up to achieve a specific, tangible goal while secretly keeping in mind that no identity is actually that simple.
It's like wearing a team jersey to a protest or a political fight.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
You put on the jersey that says women's rights or working class solidarity so the cameras know what side you're on so you can rally with your teammates and so you can actually win the game against the opposing force.
Yes.
But when the protest is over and you go home, you don't actually believe you are the jersey. You take it off. You know you are a complex person with 1,000 different traits that have nothing to do with that label.
That is an excellent analogy. You used the jersey strategically. The term was originally coined by Spivak in the 1980s to describe the work of a highly influential group called the Subaltern Studies Collective.
Who were they?
They were a group of radical South Asian historians led by scholars like Ranajit Guha, and they were trying to write the history of Indian peasant uprisings against the British Empire. But they ran into a massive problem with the archives. The official British colonial records only talked about the British elites and the Indian aristocracy. Meanwhile, the traditional Marxist historians of the time were only interested in the urban, industrial working class.
So both sides just completely ignored the rural agricultural peasants.
Exactly. Even though they made up the vast majority of the population and had staged these massive, bloody rebellions.
Peasants were entirely erased from the official map of history.
Exactly. So these historians decided they needed to recover this history. To do so, they grouped all these incredibly diverse rural people who spoke different languages, belonged to different castes, practiced different religions. They grouped them all together under the single label of the subaltern peasant. They wrote about peasant consciousness as if it were a single, unified, essential thing.
And from a strict philosophical standpoint, that is totally essentialist. They are stereotyping millions of diverse people into one unified blob called the peasant.
They absolutely were. But Spivak looked at their work and said, look, philosophically, yes, this is essentialism. But strategically, in order to fight the massive erasure of colonial history, it is a brilliant and necessary move.
Because they couldn't fight the British historical narrative by writing 5 million individual biographies.
Right, they needed a unified front. They were using essentialism as a tool, not claiming it was an absolute biological or cultural truth.
But the sources note that she later became really frustrated with this concept and actively distanced herself from her own term. What happened? Did people misunderstand the Jersey metaphor?
They forgot it was a strategy. Or rather, they found it too convenient to remember it was only a strategy. Spivak became deeply dismayed because academics and activists started using strategic essentialism as an alibi to just be lazy essentialists. People would write papers making massive, sweeping generalizations about the third world woman or the global South experience.
And when someone called them out on it and said, hey, you are erasing the difference between a wealthy woman in Mumbai and a poor farmer in Kenya, they would just hold up their hands and say, oh, don't worry, I'm just being strategically essentialist.
Exactly. It became a get-out-of-jail-free card for stereotyping. Spivak argued that a strategy only suits a specific situation. It is a targeted intervention. It is not a grand theory of everything.
If you keep wearing the team jersey 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, even when you aren't playing the game, you've just become an essentialist.
Right. You've lost the critical vigilance that was supposed to make the strategy work in the first place. You have to remember the danger of the tool you were using. A hammer is great for driving a nail, but if you treat it as the only tool in the world, you start smashing things that don't need to be smashed.
Which brings us to a really dark and vital reality in Spivak's work.
Yeah.
Because even when we use strategic essentialism carefully to fight for the oppressed, even when we try our absolute hardest to group people up to give them a voice, there are always people who fall through the cracks.
Sadly, yes.
There are people whose voices are completely erased, not just by the oppressors, but also by the resistance movements trying to help them.
This is perhaps the most profound theme in Spivak's entire bibliography. It is the concept of the subaltern and the voices that are structurally left behind.
Okay, we've used that word subaltern a few times now regarding those historians, but let's really drill down and define it. Where does this word actually come from?
So originally, subaltern was just a standard British military term for a junior officer, someone lower in rank, a subordinate. But its modern political meaning comes from the Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci.
Gramsci's a fascinating figure. He was writing from prison, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. Gramsci was a communist leader in Italy, and he was imprisoned by Benito Mussolini's fascist regime in 1926. He spent the rest of his life in prison writing his famous prison notebooks. Because his writings were heavily censored by the fascist guards, he had to use code words. He couldn't write the proletariat or the oppressed classes, so he repurposed the military term subaltern to describe the unorganized, deeply oppressed rural peasants in southern Italy.
What made them subaltern rather than just, poor?
Gramsci used the term to describe populations that were so marginalized, so entirely outside the systems of hegemonic power, that they didn't even have a unified political consciousness.
I see.
The urban factory workers in the north of Italy, they could form unions and strike. They had a voice within the system. The rural peasants in the south had nothing. They were completely subject to the ruling classes, fragmented and voiceless in the political arena.
And then, decades later, the Subaltern Studies Group in India took Gramsci's term and applied it to South Asia to talk about the Indian peasants under British rule.
Right. They shifted the geographic focus but kept the core concept studying the people at the absolute bottom of the power structure. But here is where Spivak steps in with a devastating critique of her own colleagues.
What did she find?
She looked at the groundbreaking work of those subaltern studies historians, and she realized that in their noble essentialist effort to recover the history of the male Indian peasant, they were still completely leaving out women.
Because women in those societies were subjected to a double marginalization?
Exactly.
They were oppressed by the economic poverty and violence of British colonialism, just like the men. But they were also oppressed by the deep structural patriarchy of their own native culture. They were pushed down by the colonizer and pushed down by the colonized men.
Precisely. They were at the very bottom of the social strata, falling through the cracks of both the imperial records and the resistance records. And to illustrate just how absolute, how total this erasure is, Spivak tells a harrowing true story in her most famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?
Yes, I read this.
It is the story of a young Indian woman named Bhubaneswari Paturi.
This story in the sources is incredibly powerful. It really puts all this abstract theory into flesh and blood. Walk us through what happened to Bhubaneswari.
So it takes place in North Calcutta in 1926. Ironically, the exact same year Gramsci was thrown into prison in Italy. Bhubaneswari was a young, middle-class woman, about 16 or 17 years old. One day, in her father's apartment, she hanged herself.
Now, in that specific cultural and historical context, how did society immediately interpret the suicide of a young, unmarried woman?
At that time, if a young, unmarried woman committed suicide, the family and the broader society immediately defaulted to one assumption. It was out of shame because of an illicit pregnancy.
It was a tragic but culturally recognized narrative of female disgrace.
Yes. A woman breaks the sexual rules of patriarchy, she is ruined, and she takes her life to save her family from the ultimate shame. That was the only narrative box available for her death.
But that wasn't the truth of her life at all, was it?
No, not at all. Decades later, it was discovered that Bhubaneswari was not involved in a scandalous romance. She was actually a member of a covert, armed, anti-colonial group fighting for Indian independence.
Which is incredible agency for a teenage girl.
Exactly. Despite her age, she had been entrusted by the group with a political assassination mission.
But she didn't go through with it.
She realized, for whatever reason, she couldn't do it. And she knew the grim reality of her situation. Because she failed the mission, the British colonial authorities would inevitably close in and capture her. She knew that under brutal police interrogation, she might break and reveal the secrets and identities of her political group.
So she took her own life to avoid capture and to protect her comrades.
She did. She didn't die as a disgraced girl. She died as a political soldier falling on her sword.
Wow.
And she was brilliant. She understood exactly how the patriarchal society around her functioned. She knew that the second her body was found, they would assume she was pregnant and ashamed. She knew her political sacrifice would be erased by gendered stereotypes. So she meticulously planned her death to prevent that erasure.
And this is the specific, striking detail that the text focuses on and why we have to dig into the mechanics of this story. She intentionally waited to end her life. She waited until she was menstruating. Why?
Because she wanted to leave undeniable biological proof that she was not pregnant. By timing her suicide while she was actively menstruating, she was trying to force her family, the coroner, and society to look for a different reason for her death.
She was trying to scream through the very state of her physical bodily remains that her death was political, not a result of a scandalous romantic affair.
Yes. She understood the worlding that was about to happen to her memory, and she tried to rewrite the script they would force upon her.
That is just chilling. The level of desperation, but also the sharp, calculating intellect to try and send a message from beyond the grave using the only material she had left, her own body. Did it work? When they found her, did they understand her message?
No, and this is the profound tragedy that Spivak uses to anchor her entire philosophy. Even with this meticulous planning, even with undeniable biological proof, her family and her society still erased her political agency.
They still erased it.
Decades later, when Spivak, who actually had family connections to Bhubaneswari, interviewed the surviving family members, they still referred to her death as the tragic, emotional, irrational act of a distressed girl. Her political life, her role as a freedom fighter, was completely swallowed up by the patriarchal assumptions of her culture.
Why? Why would the family ignore the biological proof?
Because the cognitive dissonance was too great. To accept that she timed her death with her menstrual cycle to prove a point meant accepting that this teenage girl was a political agent, an assassin, a thinker capable of radical action.
They just couldn't compute that.
The patriarchal structure of that society simply had no category for a female political martyr in that domestic space. It was psychologically easier for the family to mourn a disgraced girl than to acknowledge a female revolutionary. The patriarchal paradigm blinded them to literal physical facts.
So the British colonial authorities didn't care about her because she was just another native subject, and her own patriarchal society couldn't comprehend her having political agency. She fell through every single crack.
Which leads perfectly into Spivak's most famous and, frankly, most often misunderstood phrase. The subaltern cannot speak.
I've heard this phrase thrown around a lot in academic circles, and on the surface, if you don't know the context, it sounds incredibly insulting.
It does.
It sounds like Spivak is declaring that oppressed people are mute, or that they lack the intellectual capacity to articulate their own desires. It sounds like she is stripping them of their agency.
That is the most common misreading of her work, and it is deeply wrong. When Spivak says the subaltern cannot speak, she does not mean that oppressed people literally have no voices, or no physical ability to utter words, or no agency. Look at Bhubaneswari. She had immense agency. She screened her message through the calculated timing of her death. She spoke as loudly as a human being possibly can.
So if she spoke, why does Spivak say she cannot speak?
Because Spivak is defining speech not just as making noise, but as a transaction. A speech act requires both a speaker and a listener. What Spivak means is that the structures of power, the colonial state, the patriarchal family, the historical archives, are so deaf, so completely rigged, that even when the subaltern screams, the message cannot be received. The receiver is turned off by design.
It's like transmitting a radio signal on a frequency that no one else has the hardware to tune into.
Yeah.
The signal is strong, the transmitter is working perfectly, but if the institutional framework to hear it just doesn't exist, your speech act fails.
Exactly. The subaltern cannot speak because the space for them to be heard has been foreclosed. They are caught between the violence of colonialism and the violence of domestic patriarchy. For a subaltern woman like Bhubaneswari to be truly heard and understood as a political actor, the entire social and political system would have to change so drastically that she would no longer be subaltern.
Because by definition, being subaltern means you are cut off from the lines of social mobility and communication. Okay, this brings up a crucial transition. Why is the system so deaf? Why is it structurally impossible for the Bhubaneswaris of the world to be heard? What is the actual mechanism that turns off the receiver?
The mechanism is something Spivak calls epistemic violence. And it is vital to understand that violence isn't just physical. It's not just armies, guns, and prisons. The deafness of the system is baked into the very way we define knowledge, reason, and truth.
Let's define the terms here. Epistemic violence, meaning violence committed through knowledge.
Yes. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with the theory of knowledge. It asks, how do we know what we know? What counts as a valid fact?
Yeah.
Epistemic violence is the way knowledge is weaponized to justify political domination. It is the process where the colonizer's version of reality becomes the only official, legitimate reality, systematically erasing and delegitimizing the knowledge systems of the colonized. Let's look at how Spivak illustrates this through literature, because before she is a political theorist, she is a brilliant literary critic.
Let's do it. How does a novel show epistemic violence?
She points to a classic cornerstone of English literature, Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre, and she pairs it with its prequel, written a century later by the Caribbean author John Rhys, called Wide Sargasso Sea.
Okay, I know Jane Eyre.
Now, if you read Jane Eyre, you have this famous character, Bertha Mason, the quote-unquote mad woman in the attic. Bertha is a Creole woman from Jamaica whom Mr. Rochester married in his youth. In Bronte's text, Bertha is portrayed as this animalistic, insane, violent obstacle to Jane and Rochester's pure English happiness.
Right.
She has no real voice. She just growls, rips up wedding veils, and eventually sets the house on fire.
Right. In the context of Jane Eyre, Bertha isn't really a human being. She is just a dark, chaotic plot device designed to make Rochester look like a tragic, burdened hero, and to make Jane look rational and pure by contrast.
Exactly. Bertha is the raw, unthinking savage that highlights English civilization. But Jean Rhys writes Wide Sargasso Sea to show the epistemic violence that produced the madwoman in the attic.
She flips the perspective.
Yes. We see this woman, originally named Antoinette, living in Jamaica. She is a complex, sensitive human being. Then Rochester arrives. We see her subjected to the brutal violence of a colonial marriage.
How does Rochester unmake her? What are the mechanics of that violence?
It is entirely epistemic and psychological. He takes control of her wealth, legally stripping her of her independence. He takes her away from the Caribbean environment she understands and brings her to a cold, alien England.
And then what does he do to her identity?
Most violently, he refuses to call her by her real name, Antoinette, and violently renames her Bertha. He constantly gaslights her, ignoring her version of reality until her mind actually breaks.
Oh, wow.
Her descent into madness isn't some inherent tropical disease or genetic flaw. It is the direct, manufactured result of the psychological and epistemic violence of imperialist patriarchy. Rochester literally rewrites her identity, overwriting Antoinette with Bertha to control her.
That is a phenomenal example to
Yeah.
actually see the machinery of how a person is hollowed out and replaced with a colonial caricature.
It's terrible.
The sources also mention another piece of literature, a story by the Bengali author Mahasweta Devi called Breast Giver. Spivak translated this story, and it seems to tackle epistemic violence from a different angle, not from a colonizer, but from the native elites.
Yes, and it is a devastating, visceral story. It's about a subaltern woman named Jashoda. She is incredibly poor, and after her husband loses his legs in an accident, she becomes the sole breadwinner.
How does she make money?
She does this by becoming a professional wet nurse for a wealthy, upper-caste Brahmin family. She basically spends her entire adult life continually pregnant and lactating to feed the children of the rich.
So her physical body is treated entirely as an agricultural machine for economic production.
Exactly. She is a biological factory for the elites. But here is where the epistemic violence kicks in. As the years go by, the wealthy elites start viewing her not as an exploited worker, but as a holy symbol of Mother India. They mythologize her, they write songs praising her, they hold her up as the selfless, infinitely giving mother of the nation.
Which sounds like a compliment on the surface. They are revering her.
But Spivak points out the horrific, violent irony of this reverence. While they turn her into a pristine, patriotic symbol of the nation, her actual physical, fleshy body decays from the relentless overexploitation.
Oh, no.
The constant forced lactation causes her to eventually develop breast cancer. And when she gets sick and can no longer produce milk, her own family abandons her. The wealthy family that called her Mother India abandons her, and she dies in a hospital ward in absolute agony, completely alone, with sores all over her breast.
So turning her into a symbol, calling her Mother India, was actually the mechanism of epistemic violence.
Wow.
The myth covered up the brutal economic exploitation of her body. They loved the idea of the giving mother, but they let the actual subaltern woman rot to death. The reverence was just a smokescreen for extraction.
Precisely. The elite nationalist myth erased the material reality of the subaltern woman's suffering.
Okay, we've seen how the colonizer destroys Antoinette and how the elite nationalist destroys Jashoda. But what if a subaltern person tries to fight back using the oppressor's own tools? I'm looking at another Mahasweta Devi story mentioned in the sources about a tribal woman named Draupadi, or Dopti.
Yes, Dopti.
She is an armed rebel, she's captured by the state police, she is brutally tortured, and then she uses an English word. She looks at the police chief and uses the word counter. She says, "Counter me." Now, she is an literate tribal woman. Is she just misusing the oppressor's language because she doesn't know any better?
Spivak argues absolutely not. This is a moment of profound resistance. When Dopti uses the English word counter, you have to understand the context. In Indian police terminology, to be killed in an encounter was a common, sanitized euphemism for a state-sanctioned extrajudicial execution.
I see. The police would just say the rebel was killed in an encounter.
Right. Dopti doesn't speak fluent English, but she deeply understands the power of that specific word within the system of state violence.
So when she demands they counter her, what is she doing?
She is engaging in what Spivak calls political displacement. After surviving horrific sexual torture, the police chief orders her to be washed and clothed so she can be presented formally. She refuses. She stands before him completely naked, refusing to be shamed by the violence they inflicted on her, and she throws their own euphemism back in their face. By demanding they counter her, she strips the word of its bureaucratic camouflage.
She takes the gun out of their hands and points it back at them rhetorically. She is saying, "I know what this word means. Stop hiding behind it and execute me if you dare, but know that I am not broken."
Exactly. She deconstructs their power. She turns the language of the oppressor against them in a way that paralyzes the police chief. He is terrified of her in that moment. It is an awe-inspiring display of subaltern agency that hacks the code of epistemic violence.
That is an incredible scene. Now, I want to pivot because the outline takes us from these visceral literary examples into something deeply theoretical but fundamentally connected. We have to talk about Immanuel Kant. The outline mentions something called the foreclosure of the native informant, and it uses Kant's philosophy of the sublime to explain how epistemic violence works at the highest levels of Western thought. Now, Kant is notoriously dense. Let's really unpack this for the listener. How does a massive 18th century European philosopher fit into the story of colonial violence?
This is where Spivak really flexes her philosophical muscles and shows that epistemic violence isn't just in bad laws or racist novels. It is woven into the very fabric of how the West defines reason. Immanuel Kant is a foundational figure in Western philosophy, specifically regarding how we understand reason, morality, and aesthetics.
Right.
In one of his major works, The Critique of Judgment, Kant spends a lot of time talking about the concept of the sublime.
How does Kant define the sublime? It's not just something being pretty, right?
No, the beautiful is pretty, the sublime is terrifying. The sublime is that feeling you get when you look at a raging Category 5 hurricane, or you stand at the edge of a massive, bottomless canyon, or you look up at a towering, jagged mountain range. It is an encounter with the raw, infinite, overwhelming power of nature that could easily crush you like a bug.
So it starts with a feeling of physical insignificance and terror.
Yes. But then, Kant argues, something incredible happens in the human mind. After that initial terror, the human mind realizes that even though nature can physically destroy your body, your mind, your rational capability can comprehend the concept of infinity. Your reason can understand the laws of the hurricane.
I think I'm following.
Therefore, your rational mind is actually superior to the blind force of nature.
So the raging hurricane acts as a mirror that allows you to see the brilliance of your own human intellect. Your reason elevates you above the raw power of the physical world, and that realization is what gives you access to higher morality and freedom.
Exactly. That is the Kantian sublime. It is the mechanism by which the human subject proves their rational superiority. But here is the devastating catch that Spivak finds when she reads Kant closely. Who gets to experience the sublime? Who gets to be the rational subject? And more importantly, what is the role of the indigenous person in this philosophical thought experiment?
Let me guess. The indigenous person is not the one standing on the cliff having a profound realization about their own intellect.
Right. Spivak shows how Western philosophy relies on an unspoken, racialized dynamic. Kant actually mentions the Aboriginal or the savage in his writings. To prove how rational and superior the European mind is, it needs a foil. It uses the concept of the native people living closely with nature as a stepping stone.
How so? Walk me through the mechanics of that.
The philosophical narrative implies that the native is just part of nature. They are governed entirely by biological instinct, superstition, and fear. When the native looks at the hurricane, they just run in terror or they worship it as a god. They are incapable of accessing this higher rational will that allows them to stand above nature.
So, in Kant's grand philosophical theater, the native is basically just part of the background scenery. The native is grouped in with the hurricane, the mountain, and the wild animals, waiting for the European intellect to arrive and conquer them all with reason.
Yes. The European mind uses the native to define what the European is not. I am rational because I am not like the savage. The native informant provides the data, the contrast, the necessary raw material for the European to build their magnificent castle of philosophy.
But once the European has achieved this realization of superiority, what happens to the native?
They are discarded.
They are completely discarded.
Completely. Spivak calls this foreclosure. In psychoanalysis, foreclosure means totally expelling something from reality. The native is expelled from the category of the true rational human. They are structurally necessary to build the theory, but they are never granted the status of an equal subject within the theory.
Wow.
This is the ultimate epistemic violence baked into the very DNA of Western Enlightenment thought. The very concept of modern Western reason requires the erasure of the native to function.
That is mind-blowing. It really is the instant soup factory on a macro-civilizational scale. We consume Kant's theories of morality, human rights, and reason without ever asking who had to be excluded and dehumanized to manufacture those theories in the first place.
And that exclusion isn't just a historical footnote. If your entire global system of law, human rights, and economics is built on a philosophical foundation that fundamentally excludes the subaltern, then no matter how much you try to include them later, the system will always fail them.
Which leads us to the ultimate question of this deep dive. If global knowledge, dating all the way back to Kant and moving through the brutal colonial era, is inherently violent, and if it relies structurally on erasing the subaltern, what is the alternative? How are we supposed to view our home, our earth, and our responsibilities to each other? How do we build a new map?
Spivak doesn't leave us without hope, but she does demand a radical shift in our vocabulary and our worldview. She makes a sharp, critical distinction between two words that we usually use interchangeably, globality and planetarity.
Let's break those down. We hear the word global everywhere.
Yeah.
Global economy, global village, globalization. What is globality, according to Spivak?
For Spivak, globalization or globality is not about human connection. It is just the march of capital. It is the imposition of the exact same system of digital exchange, finance, and extraction everywhere on Earth. It's the World Bank, it's multinational corporations, it's the digital quantification of every single natural and human resource.
It's the idea that the Earth is just a giant grid, and everything on it can be translated into data and money. A T-shirt stitched by a woman in a sweatshop in Sri Lanka working a 14-hour shift is stripped of all its human suffering and reality, and is translated into nothing more than a barcode and a profit margin on a computer screen in New York.
Exactly. Globalization claims to unite us. It uses this warm, fuzzy language of global connectivity and bringing the world closer together. But Spivak argues it actually just reduces everything, land, water, human labor, ancient cultures, into a standardized commodity that can be bought, sold, and traded on a single, uniform grid.
So globality is essentially treating the entire Earth like a vast, frictionless corporate spreadsheet. Every human life is just a cell in an Excel document.
Yes. The globe is something you can map, something you can manage, and something you can ultimately dominate. It's the ultimate high-tech extension of colonial worlding. In the global system, the subaltern is just cheap, interchangeable labor, and their culture is just another colorful product to be consumed in the global marketplace. So, to resist this destructive grid, Spivak suggests we must move toward planetarity.
Planetarity. It sounds a bit like science fiction. What does it actually mean to view the world through planetarity?
It requires a fundamental, humbling shift in perspective. To think of the planet rather than the globe is to realize that we are part of a species of alterity.
Alterity.
Alterity means absolute difference or otherness. We belong to a biological, cosmic system that is entirely beyond our total comprehension or control.
So if globality is the corporate spreadsheet where we pretend to control everything, planetarity is realizing you are actually standing in a vast, ancient, mysterious forest at midnight. You don't own the trees, you don't control the weather, and you can't map every single root system, but you are deeply, intimately a part of the ecosystem.
That is a beautiful way to understand it. The globe is a computer grid. The planet is mysterious, vast, and discontinuous. We do not own it. We inhabit the planet, as Spivak says, on loan. Planetarity demands absolute humility. It completely rejects the arrogant Kantian assumption that human reason can master and manage everything in nature.
And this brings us to a really striking concept Spivak introduces, which he draws from pre-capitalist cultures. It's the concept of haq.
Yes, haq. It is an Arabic and Urdu word deeply rooted in Islamic and South Asian traditions. It is incredibly difficult to translate perfectly into English because it means two things simultaneously. It translates to both right and responsibility.
Right and responsibility at the exact same time. Usually in the West, we think of those as two different things.
We do. In the globalized Western capitalist system, rights are almost always about individual property and boundaries. My right to own this land, my right to consume this product, my right to be left alone. Rights are about building walls around the individual, and responsibility is often viewed as a legal obligation or a heavy burden you are forced to carry.
Like paying taxes or doing jury duty, a chore.
Exactly. Haq flips that entirely. It suggests that your right is inextricably bound to your ethical connection to the other. Your responsibility to the people around you and to the planet itself is not a burden. It is your fundamental human birthright.
It's saying that my very existence, my right to call myself a human being, is intrinsically tied to my responsibility to care for the alterity, the otherness of the planet and the people on it.
Precisely. Spivak argues that we have to reactivate these older, non-capitalist, planetary ways of thinking if we are ever going to survive the ecological and social devastation brought on by globalization. And where do we learn these concepts? We have to learn them from the subaltern cultures that have maintained these concepts, even in their extreme marginalization.
Which means we are right back to the beginning doing our homework. We have to unlearn the ingrained idea that the Western capitalist model is the pinnacle of human evolution and the only way to exist. We have to do the painful work of shedding our privileges so we can finally learn to listen to the people who actually understand what it means to live on the planet on loan.
It is the ultimate antidote to epistemic violence.
This has been an incredibly deep and challenging journey. Spivak forces you to look at the very foundation of how you think. Let's recap the train we've covered to make sure these concepts stick. We started with the realization that the knowledge we take for granted is often instant soup, manufactured by a long history of colonial worlding that violently treated populated complex lands as blank slates.
We then explored the painful but ethically necessary work of unlearning our privilege as a loss, shedding the comfort of our blinders, doing the rigorous homework, and refusing the lazy cop-out of silence so we can truly engage with the other.
We looked at the tricky double-edged tool of strategic essentialism. We learned how movements can wear the team jersey for political mobilization, provided they maintain the critical vigilance to remember they can and must take it off to avoid becoming the very oppressors they are fighting.
Which brought us to the tragic structural reality of the subaltern, the people who fall through the cracks of both oppression and resistance. We saw how their voices are silenced by systems that actively refuse to hear them, illuminated by the heartbreaking brilliance of Bhubaneswari Paduri's final act.
We saw how that deafness is enforced through epistemic violence, how knowledge itself can be used to hollow out a human being like Antoinette in White Sargasso Sea, or exploit a woman like Jashoda. And we saw how that violence goes all the way up to the high-minded philosophy of someone like Kant, who foreclosed the native informant to build his theories of European reason.
And finally, we looked at the existential choice before us today, the destructive, commodifying digital march of globality versus the humbling ethical responsibility of planetarity, where we embrace our birthright of Hawk.
It really does change everything. It changes how you see the news, how you buy your clothes, and how you think about history. But before we sign off, we always want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Something to mull over on your own that builds on what we've discussed today.
This is a thought drawn directly from Spivak's warnings about our modern, hyper-connected age. Today, we live in a world governed by what she calls telecommunicative informatics. We are in the digital revolution. And in this era, the extraction hasn't stopped, it has just evolved. Today, multinational corporations and pharmaceutical companies are tapping the native informant directly in the name of gathering indigenous knowledge.
How does that work in practice?
It results in biopiracy. Corporations go into the global south to extract local agricultural knowledge or traditional medicinal plants that subaltern communities have cultivated for centuries, sequence the DNA, patent it in the West, and then sell it back on the global market at a massive profit. They're extracting the data while completely ignoring the human beings who produced it.
So the colonial extraction hasn't ended. It has just gone digital and molecular.
Exactly. I want you to look at today's digital world, where every tech CEO talks breathlessly about global connectivity and mining local data to build artificial intelligence. Ask yourself, who is the native informant being foreclosed and erased by algorithms today? When we scroll through our feeds and consume endless streams of information, are we really listening to the subaltern? Or are we just extracting their data to feed the algorithms of the global corporate mall?
Are we looking at a true planetary representation of the Earth? Or are we just staring at a very clean, very profitable, very dangerous map?
Yep.
Keep your eyes open, do your homework, and watch out for the instant soup.